just start by saying thank you to all of you for coming out on a cold and dark night, not perhaps as cold and dark as the 12th of December maybe, for various reasons, meteorological and otherwise. Welcome to the Milan Institute. We are a non-partisan body. We put on events like this, well, almost every week, so if you're not signed up to those events, do sign up on our website. We have a full program of events for next term as well as this term, and what we ideally like to do is mix and match academics with people from the real world, as it were, and put them together to discuss all sorts of topics, ranging from the event we had last week on data privacy and the ownership of data, border of economics and politics. My name is Tim Vale, and I am the co-director of the Milan Institute, together with Rob Saunders, my fellow director. I am simply here to introduce MEI, which I've done, and to hand you over to Nick, etc. They are fairly obvious here, here, and up there. Let's do my air steward routine. If the alarm goes off, please make your way through those exits to the outside of the building. Okay, we do not anticipate anything happening, but if that does happen, please go ahead. So, without more ado, I just want to remind you that we have an event on the 5th of December where we will be talking about Britain's role in the world and whether Britain can be said any longer to have a national interest, and if it does, what is that national interest, and how should it or should not be projected. I would also like to draw your attention very selfishly to an event that UK and the Changing Europe is putting on Thursday, which I'm involved, which is at King's. We are allowed to mention other universities, and is entitled Britain's Angriest Election, ? So if you can't get enough election and you can't get enough anger, you can put the two things together on Thursday at King's, and you can sign up on Eventbrite for that. So, finally, Nick, please introduce everybody else. Thank you.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Great. Hi, my name's Nick Garland. I am, among other things, a DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford. I'm really excited to be welcoming everyone here to this event. I've been told to say hello to anyone who's watching on the live stream, and to remind everyone that the hashtag for the event is MEI Corbynomics, if anyone wants to tweet along to the event. Since Jeremy Corbyn's election as leader of the Labour Party in September 2015, far more attention has been paid to the fact of his leadership than to the content of the programme envisaged by Corbyn and his allies. This changed to some extent with the apparent success of Labour's 2017 manifesto, which has taken on some totemic significance on the British left. The ideas within it proved popular and played some part in the dramatic change of Labour's fortunes in the polls during the general election campaign. However, with another general election imminent, as one of our panellists tonight has argued, it would be insufficient for Labour to simply photocopy the 2017 manifesto. And indeed, the list of policies that have emerged from the Shadow Cabinet and from Labour's annual conference in Brighton in September, from a Green New Deal to the free nationalised broadband, suggest a stepping up of the radicalism contained in that manifesto. So now seems a great time to address some of the questions that have, for much of the last 4 years, been neglected. What is Labour's analysis of what is wrong with the UK's economy? What kind of economy does Labour's newish left want to create? What are its strategies for doing so? And what are its prospects? We're really pleased to have on the panel James Meadway. James is the former economic advisor to John McDonnell, who is the Shadow Chancellor, and he was previously Chief Economist at the New Economics Foundation, has worked for the Treasury, for Nesta, and for the Royal Society. He's currently working on a book outlining a vision of an economy for the many. Caris Roberts is Chief Economist at the Institute for Public Policy Research and head of the IPPR's Centre for Economic Justice. She's previously worked for the Institute of Fiscal Policy, the Social Mobility Foundation, the RSA, and in charity impact evaluation. Florence Braithwaite at the end is a lecturer in British history at University College London. She's author of Class, Politics and the Decline of Deference in England, as well as articles on neoliberalism, Thatcherism and Labour politics. She's co-editor of Renewal, a journal of social democracy, and is currently researching the lives of women in the 1980-45 miners' strike. And finally, Simon Wren-Lewis is an economist and professor of economic policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford and a fellow of Merton College, Oxford. He is author of the popular Mainly Macro blog. His most recent book is The Lies We Were Told, Politics, Economics, Austerity and Brexit, and he regularly writes for newspapers including The Guardian. So first, we're going to ask James to kick us off, and perhaps if he could give a sort of insider's take on what Labour's objectives and strategies are and the challenges that he thinks Labour government might face. So, James.
All right. Thank you, and thank you very much for the invite to speak. I'm glad we started with some reference to the concern with process over policy and the concern with the fact of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party rather more than what it might mean or what Labour actually wants to do. Because to an extraordinary extent, I mean, this is... fake news run rampant is what you kind of have to deal with for the last sort of 4 years or so since Jeremy took over. To an extraordinary extent, the economic policy has been miscommunicated by the press in particular in Britain, but worse than that, actually, I think there's a degree of sort of make-believe that seems to have taken hold of people who really ought to know better. I'm thinking here not so much of the fact that, a week and a bit ago you had headlines in the Times and a few other newspapers claiming that Labour was going to spend £1.2 trillion, an extraordinary amount of money. So big, in fact, the Times had to put an explainer saying how big a trillion was for the benefit of its readers on the front page, and then a few pages inside had to put in a little note saying actually these figures are completely invented by the Conservative Party on the simple basis of thinking what Jeremy Corbyn might want to do and then sort of tripling the cost of the thing and then adding it all up until you get to a really big number. I mean, this is kind of fake news. This is just inventing something. This was on the basis of policies that Labour has explicitly said is not going to go in the manifesto, isn't going to happen. Like, for an example, and I do find this number a bit odd, £35 billion on abolishing private schools, which seems incredibly expensive, but that aside, it isn't going to happen. So it was nonetheless including the costing. So you have this kind of level of nonsense, not just from the press, but from people who really should know better. You pick up sometimes city briefs, these sort of analyses that like the big city firms produce for the benefit, presumably the benefit of their clients, although God knows what benefit they get out of this sort of thing. And this one was quite an exception, which is like, well, here's what Jeremy Corbyn's kind of like. It's a bit like the 1970s. And we simulated the 1970s in our forecasting model, and it was really bad. So Jeremy Corbyn's going to be really bad. And it's like this is presented as if it's a serious analysis of what Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party is about, of what the economic programme is going to be. Now, fortunately, as mentioned, you can cut through these things. And if I think there's a reason to think that Labour is in with a shout of winning this election, and certainly doing well in this election, it's because we do, in fact, have a very large army of members and supporters who can get out there and argue the case and cut through some of the nonsense. That the impact and influence of some of the major institutions in British society, the institutions that are supposed to supply people with a view of the world and inform what they're thinking, the extraordinary decline in trust and confidence in these institutions, particularly since 2008, can be registered in any number of opinion polls, but you can see it on a day-to-day basis. Who now trusts really what the newspapers report? Who now trusts what happens in Parliament? Who now trusts even the civil service? Who trusts bankers? I mean, they've gone from being like the most trusted people in British society to some of the least in the space of the last 10 years. And this extraordinary background of a collapse and decay in trust in British institutions is part of the background to why Jeremy Corbyn is leader of the Labour Party. That what you had in 2008, in a spectacular style, was a failure of the earlier economic settlement. And I think it's common enough to say, well, look, this is, the world financial system basically fell over itself and collapsed. Britain has a very, very financialised, and still has a very financialised economy. You can see down the road, in either direction, actually, the size and extent of the financial sector here. It has extraordinary amounts of debt. By the time of the crash, British households were amongst, relative to income, some of the most heavily indebted, certainly out of the major developed economies. And this system, based on debt and based on the kind of growth centred on the production of debt was always going to fail at some point, and lo and behold, it did. That's one part of it. There is a deeper failure, I think, which is the failure of the kind of New Labour compromise, which is to say, look, we'd still quite like to run the NHS, please, but we're not going to do anything that affects how the economy operates in a serious way, because what we're going to do is allow this financialised economy to grow and develop, and then kind of cream a bit off the top. So we'll charge some taxes in what the City of London is doing. That'll pay for expanding the NHS. This worked well. It delivered growth of a debt-led kind, but nonetheless, it delivered growth for a period of time. It delivered expanding public services. And despite some of the Tory mythology, it was not the case that Labour was spending wildly excessively on these things. You know, the deficit had risen somewhat. It wasn't really in the realms of saying this is a terrible disaster. You know, the reason that the economy fell apart in 2007 into 2008 was because there was a global financial crisis, and we have, as I said, a very heavily financialised economy. So that kind of worked for a bit, but it doesn't work any longer. And I think the challenge, some of the primary challenges of what Corbynomics is about and what Labour's economic programme is about, is getting beyond simply saying, OK, we have the economy, it sits there and it produces some outcomes we don't like very much, so we're going to redistribute from the top of it. We're going to tax some people more and spend a bit more over here. It's getting out of that and saying, actually, we want to do something quite fundamental to how the economy operates. We want to change the structures of how the economy operates. Under Ed Miliband, this got rather unfortunately labelled with the name of pre-distribution, which was, you know, it's the sort of thing that might appeal to policy wonks, but it's not on the proverbial Labour doorstep anytime soon. But it summarised or summed up or tried to sum up part of what's going on here. That instead of a traditional sort of social democratic understanding of what a government in power, a government of the left, a social democratic government should do, a sort of Anthony Crosland version of what it should do. Future Socialism remains a seminal book from the 50s in describing some of this, which is you have the economy, that does its thing over there, and we redistribute on top of it. It was movement out of that and into saying we're going to change how the economy operates. And we're going to do so in a way that instead of having to say, we need to redistribute to make the economy fair, we're going to have an economy that's already producing fairer outcomes. It is pre-distributed, to return to that slightly ugly portmanteau word from the Miliband years. So it's a shift and a change away from what historically, at least that section of social democracy thought it was doing. And it's necessary to do that, because if you stack up the list of economic failures that are now, you know, piled high in the kind of economy that we have, the return to a version of debt-led growth in worse circumstances. You can see, in particular, the rise in unsecured lending over the last few years as a variant of that. The failure since 2008 to produce anything like consistent rises in most people's standard of living, closely tied to the failure of productivity and productivity growth to continue on anything like its trend levels. By the way, these things are fairly common across much of the developed world. We just have a worse version of them here. That failure tied, of course, to the shocking weakness of investment, both from government. If you look on the figures for government investment, Britain for 30 years has been consistently either the bottom or very near the bottom out of the entire OECD group of government investment. At the minute, I think, but only Greece and Portugal out of the OECD group of developed economies actually spend less in terms of government investment. So it's a very, very low investment from the public sector side, but also very low investment from the private sector side. And if you don't invest, and there is a good paper by John Van Reen and one of his collaborators from about 2013 on this impact, if you don't invest, what you end up with instead is an economy where we substitute basically cheap, insecure labour for investment in capital, and we do that for a long period of time, and lo and behold, you don't get the productivity increases that you might want. And that summarises the kind of structural features of the British economy that we're working hard against. And what it means is that if you want to carry on running a national health service of the kind that we want to see, free at the point of use, actually functioning for most people rather than the kind of slow death that the Tories have inflicted on it. If you want that to carry on functioning, you have to have an economy which does produce the productivity growth, which does deliver the investment and the well-paid work and all the rest of it. And that is something that the approach taken by successive governments for a very long period of time in this country is not delivering. This neoliberal idea that all a government has to do is create conditions under which a free market can operate and private capital can operate, and then it will deliver outcomes that are good for the rest of us, has completely, by this point, failed, and failed in dramatic fashion. You can then carry on the list of failures. Take the extraordinary difference in what London, and in particular some parts of London, have relative to the rest of the country in terms of their output and in terms of their productivity. The incredible regional imbalances. Take, for instance, the imbalance in wealth and the way in which ownership, particularly of our large companies, is concentrated at the top. Stack all this up and then throw in climate change and you need a break. So the break that you get in Corbynism and in Corbynomics, I think, looks like this. The first one is that we have to end austerity. That there has to be a major part of the programme. You could see this in 2017. I'm not giving you any great surprises by saying it's going to be part of the manifesto this time round. Is deliver an increase in public spending so that we can actually repair some of the damage that we've seen in the last sort of 9 years of austerity or so. Repair the damage. But then move beyond that point and say, well, how can we expand the provision of public services? How can we get out of this penny-pinching world in which everything basically is supposed to arrive with a price tag attached and most of our public services are slowly being whittled away? How can we reverse this, public squalor, private affluence calculation so we actually have public affluence? How can we put our public services on a more fundamentally universalist basis, getting out of what I always think of as the sort of new Labour tendency to say, well, means test everything, that's fair. Well, it isn't fair. You end up under certainly the coalition and then the Conservative governments for the last 8-9 years or so, you end up with means testing turned into virtually a form of torture for universal credit claimants. That instead of this, you introduce universalism. Hence, you say government will invest in broadband and you make the broadband free because this is approaching being a utility and it's a fundamental of life in a modern economy, and that's why you do it. So universalism as a principle there. That you also want to build new institutions, that some of the academics writing on this, I'm thinking of Joe Guyon and Martin O'Neill in particular, have described as Labour's institutional turn, that you create new institutions. Labour has done this in the past. Think of the National Health Service. It's did it to a somewhat less fundamental extent under New Labour. You build new institutions. You create a National Investment Bank and regional development banks. You build these institutions. You build the support for those institutions. And this is part of how you're going to transform the economy. You are not simply there to redistribute. You're there to build something. So it's the institutional turn. And then finally, of course, is what gets labelled the ownership agenda. We have an incredible inequality of wealth. In Britain. The Thomas Piketty figures make this very clear, and also make it clear, by the way, the shift in the last 40 years or so from being a relatively equal society to being one of the more unequal societies. How do you change that ownership? How do you change it in a way so that our corporations, which are not investing as they should at the minute, our smaller businesses which don't have the opportunity to invest as they should at the minute. How can you change that ownership so you're not just transferring the wealth, you're changing the basis in which these companies and these institutions work? And that's part of the ownership agenda. That's why things like the inclusive ownership funds, the idea that large companies will be asked to transfer shares to their workers, is both a transfer of wealth, addressing inequalities of wealth, but also we think addressing the governance of those large companies, because we know, and you can dig out evidence from even the Treasury here, that companies with forms of worker ownership tend to invest more, think longer term, be more productive. In other words, you're putting these things together and presenting a package in which you're no longer simply saying the economy functions much as we want, and then we redistribute just to patch up the bits that don't work. We're saying we need to get into the engine. We need to get into the engine and change how the thing operates, and do so in a way that produces outcomes that are both better for most of us in the sense of being more equal, better for most of us in the sense of being more democratic, and I think as a final fundamental in this, better for most of us in the sense of starting to address the real challenge of climate change and the rest of it. So that's the package here. I think Simon's going to talk particularly about the sort of macroeconomics of it, which I tend to view as not the most important, part of the whole thing. That quite deliberately we've always attempted to keep the macroeconomics as mainstream, as clear and as consistent as possible, because what we want is a stable economy, because that's how you're going to be able to change how the institutions work. But the driver of Corbynomics is that shift away from social democracy, a shift into being more radical about how you're going to change the economy, and attempt to say to people that we have to do this if we want to secure an economy that works for all of us. Thank you.
Great. Great. Thank you, James. So, Caris, it would be great to hear kind of a bit about what you think generally about sort of what Labour's doing and the sort of issues that James was just talking about, but also more specifically about the work that IPPR, Centre for Economic Justice, will be doing. So.
Great. Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming along tonight. It's great to see so many of you here, particularly as we're in the midst of the election campaign. It's great to see so many people interested in economic issues and what the different parties are offering. I'm going to start off by saying a bit about some work that we've done, which and then kind of relate that to the Labour Party's agenda. So I work at IPPR, which is a progressive policy think tank, and the piece of work that I want to talk about is something called the Commission on Economic Justice, which some people might have come across. It was a 2-year programme that we ran, and we set it up in 2016 on the basis that observing the economy and observing the Brexit debate and the referendum debate, our sense was that economic policy had both been neglected in terms of its import in the public policy debate, and that you could, a lot of these problems that we were seeing in politics stemmed from deep economic problems that we had in the UK economy. So we set ourselves quite a broad exam question of how do we fix the economy and make it both prosperous and just. And we brought together people from across the economy, so trade unions, business, the Archbishop of Canterbury, academics, to discuss this problem. We did a lot of work and released a final report last year, and I'm just going to run through a few of the key arguments. So some of these will be familiar from what James was just talking about, but in terms of some key problems, at the heart of this was the fact that wages have not been keeping up with growth from the past 10 years, but also going back further. So if you look at who has gained from economic growth over the past 40 years, you see that actually only about 10% of growth went to the bottom 50% of people. More recently, if you look at what's happened since 2008, you've seen the decoupling of wages from growth and from GDP growth. So even though we're seeing what is seen as economic success in typical terms, that isn't actually translating into how people feel about their lives and how people actually have money in their pockets to spend. Related to this is a deep problem that James mentioned of low productivity. So since the crash, what we've seen is that productivity is completely flatlined. But the problem is actually deeper than that as well. So we've been underperforming our neighbours in terms of productivity performance for about 30 years. That stems in part from a deep lack of investment. So there's kind of real problems in terms of the engines of growth that we might see in the economy. But then there are also some more kind of apparent problems that many people here will recognise. So, for instance, the fact that we have one of the most regionally divergent countries in Europe in terms of outcomes at the regional level. So you have some of the richest areas in Europe, but also some of the poorest. And then we also looked at this problem of wealth inequality. So over the kind of past 40 years, particularly as house prices have risen, what you've seen is huge increases in the amount of wealth in the UK. And that has led to some people essentially having far more than others. On certain measures, wealth inequality hasn't actually increased, but the absolute amount of wealth in the economy has. And that means that it's much harder to get a secure home, to get a house, to reach the top deciles of wealth just through work and saving alone. So we looked at these problems across the economy, and we make a few big arguments. The first is that the economy is in need of fundamental reform. So what we mean by that is that many of these problems go back 30 years or more. This isn't a matter of tinkering around the edges. What we need is wholesale change in terms of how the economy is run. We argue that that should be on the scale of previous paradigm shifts in economics and economic policy making. Even if not the same direction, what we saw, for instance, post-1945 and in 1979 and the 80s were big shifts in how we organised the economy, who owned elements of the economy, and in whose interests it worked for. So we argue for a similar shift again. We argue that a fairer economy is a stronger economy. So the kind of orthodoxy is that you have to trade off equity and efficiency. But actually, if you look at the international evidence of which countries perform strongest and have the most stable economies, you can see that actually fairness does generate a stable and strong economy. And in light of that, we argue that we need to hardwire the economy for justice. And this goes back to what James was talking about in that the kind of consensus that you can just let the economy do its thing and then tax and redistribute afterwards, we thought had categorically failed, particularly in terms of the Brexit vote and the political dissatisfaction that you see across the country, that you do actually need to make sure that the economy is delivering fairer outcomes from the beginning. To do that, we think that you need a fundamental shift in who holds power in the economy. So a lot of economics, not all of it, but a lot of economics takes power out of the equation. And we thought it was absolutely vital that we put that back in and look at who has power and how that determines outcomes that you see. So those were some big arguments that we made. And we had a lot of policy recommendations, 73 in total, and you'll be relieved to hear I'm not going to go through them all today. But there are a few key ones that I think are particularly pertinent to the agenda that you see in Labour's economic policy at the moment. So, for instance, the shift in power towards workers. So we argue that we do need to renew collective bargaining up to targets of 50%, to revive the union sector, and also to put workers on boards. And that's because, quite simply, workers aren't getting their fair share of the fruits of the economy as they arise. We argue that alongside that, it's very important that we have to shift who owns elements of the economy. So it's not enough to kind of only look at employment incomes. We know that a huge amount of the wealth that the UK economy generates goes towards capital owners, and it therefore matters who owns that capital. And this is related both in terms of kind of housing wealth, but also in terms of who owns company shares. So we had measures to increase the ownership of company shares across the economy. Third, we argue that technological change, despite kind of being feared by a lot of people, can actually bring huge benefits. In terms of, for instance, data, big data could actually generate huge social returns if we used it effectively. Similarly, automation could deliver big productivity benefits. But if we don't intervene to shape that and determine where it goes, then those things really could also generate huge inequities of power and reward. We argue that the state always, in fact, plays a role in market shaping, so there is no such thing as a market existing outside of the state, but the state should be intervening in a coordinating role and in particularly in terms of investing and directing the resources in the economy. So, for instance, through a green mission, which bears relation to the Green Industrial Revolution that you might have heard Labour talk about, or the Green New Deal campaign. And then finally, I think it's worth mentioning as well that shifting power in the economy should also involve devolving power and decision-making to the areas that are affected. So we argue for new tiers of economic governance that would be able to do that effectively. So like I said, I think a lot of this you can see in Labour's agenda, particularly relating to kind of shifting power towards workers, the ownership agenda. I actually hadn't thought that they had a great devolution offering, but recently they've come out with very strong words in terms of spreading power, particularly to the north, to make decisions over the economy. And then similarly, some of the ideas in terms of, for instance, being kind of forward-looking and seeing the benefits that technology could bring, but shaping that so that everyone can benefit, I also think you see reflected in things like the broadband offer. So there is quite a lot of synergy between the work that we did and spent quite a lot of time talking to the Labour team about and what you are likely to see in the manifesto this week. There are a couple of places where we think they should be going further. So, for instance, we've argued that capital gains tax should be equalised to taxes on income from employment, so that wherever you get your income from, you pay the same tax. At the moment, people who have capital actually pay less tax on the gains that they make. So there's definitely kind of a strong synergy between what we did and Labour's agenda. But I think what's quite important as we go through the next few weeks and in terms of the election debate is that both the appetite for change and the ideas behind our work and behind the Labour agenda currently are more enduring than one particular party, one particular election, and one particular leader, in fact. And that we need to make sure that they are bigger for them to be successful. So we know that, for instance, if you want to enact change on a broader scale and really enduring change, such as Thatcher did through the kind of 40 years since Thatcherism, then you do actually need to try and achieve a paradigm shift. And that's why we made sure that we had voices from across the economy advocating for the change that we argued for. But we do know that these ideas are very popular. So we did some polling, which was out yesterday, which shows that, this is pretty huge, 60% of people in the UK think that we should be changing the way the economy is run, and many of those think that that should be radical change. Just 2% think that we should stick with things how they are. So essentially, these ideas are extremely popular, and there will be many people, I think, in the wash-up after the election, regardless of the result, who will try and kind of dispute the popularity of these ideas. But I think it's important to note that there is broad spread support for them, and that is a good thing, because we would need that if this genuine agenda for economic change is to carry on into the future.
Great. Thanks, Karis. And so next, we're going to come to Florence, who is going to give a bit of kind of a broader perspective on the kind of intellectual debate within Labour and sort of some of the ideas we've talked about.
Thanks. Thanks very much, and thanks everyone for coming. So I'm going to organise my comments here around three questions. The first of my three questions is, to what extent is there a coherent and radical vision underlying the Corbyn-McDonnell economic project? And that's a question that I think that James and Karis have quite effectively answered. I think there is and has been emerging over the last few years a coherent economic project here, and I think it centres on two key things that each of them has mentioned. First of all, this shift away from seeing macroeconomic policy as the place where you're going to be focused towards attempting to change the fundamental institutions of the economy in order to change how it functions. And second, as Karis said, paying attention to where power lies within the economy, trying to use these institutional changes to shift the balance of power in order to kind of push power downwards out of the hands of a few people and towards a much wider range of people. And there's been a whole set of policies developed in order to do that, from kind of thinking about the top level, thinking about a kind of national investment bank, down to thinking about how local councils organise their procurement and their spending in order that the money that they spend should go into local businesses, co-ops, businesses with good worker representation, businesses with good trade unions. This is the kind of Preston Model. It's all about building community wealth through what local government is doing. And there's a whole range, a whole suite of other policies in between that attempt to achieve this. So I think there is a kind of coherent and radical vision here, and I think that it does represent a lot more than simply an attempt to kind of turn back the clock to the sort of social democratic political economy that we broadly had between sort of 1945 and around the 1970s. So my second question is, to what extent might this coherent and radical vision come to actually represent a paradigm shift in our political economy? So to think about this question, I want to think about those two most recent moments when Britain actually had a kind of paradigm shift in our political economy, 1945 and 1979, or the periods of time around those two dates, which we now kind of take as shorthand for paradigm shifts in the economy, but actually, of course, those paradigm shifts took a lot longer to happen. So it's interesting from a historical perspective to think, first of all, about the ways in which there are similarities, quite striking similarities, between the moment that we're now in and those two preceding moments. So, very briefly, just to talk about a few of those similarities. First of all, both of those moments were very obviously preceded by decades of crisis, decades that were widely constructed as crisis for Britain's political economy in different ways. In 1929, you of course had the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression. The 1970s and the late 1960s in Britain were widely constructed by people both on the left and on the right as a period of crisis. And of course, people were looking to things like very high levels of trade union militancy, very high spikes in inflation when they defined that period as a period of crisis. So they were both preceded by moments that were widely seen as moments of crisis, and intimately linked to that fact, they were both preceded by periods of time where the political system seemed to be in a certain amount of flux. You had more people than usual crossing the floor of the House of Commons to defect to other parties. You had new parties being formed, and there was a sense that it was less clear than usual where the dividing line between left and right lay. So in various ways, I think there are similarities with what we see now. We quite obviously live in a period where a lot of people have been talking about crisis for a long time, after the 2008 financial crisis, and also the climate crisis. And we live in a time when there have been a lot of people crossing the floor, being expelled from their parties. There have been new parties formed. So that suggests that there is a potential here for a similar paradigm shift. And I think that the Labour Party is the only party that has really done much to actually develop a radical new economics. I think the other parties are still really caught in the incredibly difficult trap of sort of trying to make what is a really faltering economic system work. But one thing that I want to just talk briefly about is whether or not this potential adds up to a kind of inevitability. So if there are similarities between the moment we're living in now and previous moments where we've seen paradigm changes in our political economy, does that mean that it's inevitable that such a paradigm shift will occur? And I think that what looking at history suggests is that it's not inevitable. Those paradigm shifts had to be fought for, and that meant politics and it meant power were the key things that determined what the outcomes were. If we just think about the 1970s, it is instructive to remember that Thatcher's proposed solution to the crisis, was not the only one on offer. There was, of course, an alternative, radical economics coming from the Bennite wing of the Labour Party. So there was an alternative set of responses to the crisis, and in fact, an alternative analysis of what the crisis was, because any paradigm shift in political economy, I think, always begins with a new way of thinking about what the problem actually is, and then moves on to suggesting a new way of doing things. So when we look at the past, we can see that there were alternatives that were on offer that came to be disregarded, sidelined because of politics and because of power, which means that if we want this paradigm shift to happen in the way that the Labour Party wants it to happen, that is going to take a political fight and a lot of political will and a lot of thinking about the question of power, where power lies, and how we build up alternative sources of power, for example, the trade union movement within our economy. So very, very briefly, just to finish off, I want to talk about my third question a little bit more then. So my third question is, what then is the relationship between Corbynism and Bennism, the kind of Bennite alternative economic strategy, that radical economics that was being developed in the 70s and early 80s? And here, I suppose what I want to say is that there is a kind of intellectual lineage here. There are ways in which the Corbyn project draws on ideas that were developed in the 70s and early 80s. But I think that there is a critical difference, and that is a difference that actually I think Karas and Jones have both sort of highlighted to some extent. I think Ben and the Bennite left in the 70s and 80s were very, they existed in a moment where, despite the interest that people like Tony Benn very clearly had in things like new social movements, in things like the Upper Clydeside shipbuilders work in democratising the economy, in pushing power down into the hands of workers, this is also a moment that was deeply marked by a set of paternalistic assumptions about how state and economy would work. And so there was a tension at the heart of that project, which I don't think was ever fully resolved. I think the Corbyn-McDonnell project has very clearly taken a side on this and has come down on the side of not paternalism, but of democratising the economy, of putting power into the hands of people actually working in the economy, and also of people who are citizens, consumers, people in local government. So that, I think, is the critical and I think really positive and important distinction between the Bennite project of the past and the Corbyn-McDonnell project of today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Florence. And finally, Simon, if you could maybe respond to some of what you've heard, what do you agree with, what maybe concerns you, and what maybe do you think is missing? And also, I think you wanted to discuss a bit the sort of fiscal question, which is so obviously important to this discussion.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to be the boring person who talks about macroeconomics, but only very briefly. Because what I would say is that, looking at movements like this in the past, what has often derailed them has actually been macroeconomics. And one of the interesting, again, differences between the current project, if you call it that, and the sort of Bennite left, is a kind of acceptance of the basic rules of macroeconomics that we currently have. So there's no real challenge on monetary policy. The Bank of England is going to stay independent. And on fiscal rules, essentially what John McDonnell's had chosen to do is to go with a state-of-the-art fiscal rule. That, I think, is really important because it's going to do a number of things. It's going to immunise, to some extent, attacks on Labour from some of the routes that you've had them before. I don't think, at least beyond maybe the first few days, we're going to see a sudden sterling crisis. In fact, I think we're going to see the opposite, because with all this investment being pumped into the economy, demand is likely to rise and the Bank of England will raise interest rates. And that is a good thing from a macroeconomic point of view, although I think there are some stresses it will cause which the government will have to handle and think about handling. In terms of just the differences between the parties, let me just say one of the good things that happened is that, and again, Labour in the lead here, is this divorce between capital and current spending. So no longer we have limits on capital spending. All the parties agree we should have more public investment, but Labour have much more than the other parties, which I think is appropriate. If you look at economists over the last sort of 5-10 years, they've almost all been saying we must have more public investment, huge need for it. On current spending, the parties are fairly similar. Labour's rule is much more flexible and therefore much more sensible, more robust to shocks. But it will come under immediate pressure from the departments, if you like. Everybody will want McDonnell to spend more on current spending as well as capital spending. So he's going to have to become one of these iron chancellors and become effectively very unpopular. I don't know what James thinks. I think he's up for that job, but we'll see. And then finally, Labour, unlike the other parties, have recession-proofed their fiscal rule. If there is a recession, I think it will be more unlikely with a Labour government, then essentially fiscal policy switches its role to stimulate the economy, and that's really important. Okay, just one sort of factual thing that has been said that I want to at least dispute. There's a tendency with the left to disparage everything that happened since 1979. On the productivity side, that isn't actually right. UK productivity performance was better than the international average really until the global financial crisis. And that wasn't ephemeral, it's because governments did various things. They worked very hard on improving productivity. For example, Thatcher basically entered the single market, created and entered the single market, which was a huge boost to service sector productivity. And New Labour worked hard on improving competition through skills and through improving productivity, through increasing competition, increasing skills and that kind of thing. So, the past hasn't been bad. What happened from 2010 is we had a government said, well, we don't need to worry about this anymore. The private sector will just look after it. And we've seen the results of that. One of the things that James mentioned was universalism, the idea that we have universal benefits. And that's one reason why McDonald's going to have to be an Iron Chancellor, because the problem with that policy is expensive. So that links back into the need for fiscal rules. I think the institutional turn is very important. And in a sense, it's making the economy more European. The idea of a national investment bank is sometimes seen as scandalous here. It's sort of quite natural in countries in Europe. So I think that's an easy bit, if you like. We just copy what's going on. I think one thing that nobody's talked about, which it will be good to talk about, is how the government ends the regional disparities that are built up over and that has built up over ever since the Thatcher period. And I mean, what's been talked about is sort of the democracy involved and making this a state-run thing, but giving money to regions to invest, and that's important. But the details of that are crucial. If you split it up into too many little bits, then you don't get the coordination and the dynamism that you could get from larger units actually administering funds. So that's something I think it's worth talking about. And also, what role has public investment from the middle, from the state, got to play in this? That's, I think, something that's important. How do we get innovation into the regions? Those are all key issues to whether a Labour government will be successful. I absolutely agree with the idea that we have to shift from a shareholder-based economy because it just doesn't really work. How you do that and the mechanics of it are crucial, and it involves giving workers more control. I'm a little bit sceptical that just giving them shares does that, and I'd like that to be talked about a little bit more. So that's the inclusive ownership funds that James just mentioned. And then I think the final thing that I just wanted to talk about a little bit is the sort of first 100 days or 6 months or 9 months of the Labour government are going to be horrendous in terms of workload. There's so many ideas, such a lot to do, and there's only a finite amount of time that ministers will actually have to do it. And on top of that, you've got Brexit, which has got to be done in 6 months. And that means you've got to start having priorities. What do you focus efforts on first, and what do you leave to do later? And that's something that governments never, or parties in oppositions, never like to think about beforehand. And it is dangerous if they don't, because they try and do everything and fail in most things. So I think some idea of what's important to do first and what can you leave to later is something that it's worth discussing. Okay, I think that's all I had to say.
Great, thank you, Simon. Just before opening up to the floor, I wanted to sort of put points that just came up in the discussion to other panellists. So first, Simon, you sort of raised this point about priorities and the kind of challenge of what Labour should do in the first 100 days. What are the sort of policy limitations on Labour? I might add to that also, when we see so many policy announcements coming from Labour, the other question is, to what extent should Labour be focusing on a kind of very disciplined pledge card style message versus to what extent should Labour be saying, you know, be giving this sort of long laundry list of sort of spending commitments. So I'd be interested to know especially what James has to say about that, but maybe also what Karis thinks about, you know, having just produced a report with 73 policy ideas, to what extent it's important to sort of focus on a few, or to what extent it is actually possible to have this kind of broader radical agenda kind of going all at once. And then the other point, which is the point that Karis raised, was this kind of question of whether all of these kind of radical ideas are basically totally contingent on the outcome of the general election that's happening in 3 weeks' time. And so Florence, kind of in relation to sort of what you were saying about paradigm shifts, I'd be quite interested to hear what you had to say to that. Again, perhaps James, kind of what you think about that question of whether these ideas are sort of durable, whether other governments of one stripe or another are likely to sort of implement changes along these lines, or whether, you know, kind of everything is now contingent on December the 12th. I don't know, Simon, if you might have any thoughts on that as well, but if you do please share them. So I'll probably go to James first, given that I've just, or do you want a minute, given I've just given you everything? Or?
I can try. All right. Yeah, so look, I think the question of prioritisation is central. And it's central in two senses. One, it's central in terms of what you do in government and what can you do straight away, and an appreciation of the limits of what you can and can't do in government. This is if you're on the left for any period of time, I mean, really, for most of the last sort of 20, 30 years, the question of what you might do in government has never really turned up. You know, it wasn't, ever since the decline of Bennism, it just wasn't a serious prospect. And that shift from basically seeing yourself as somebody who sort of stands outside and demands that somebody else does something, to being in a situation where you have to do something, that you can demand on the government it does something, like you protested it. It's quite different if you are the government and you have to sort this thing out. And that is where the issue of prioritisation comes in. I think in terms of what Labour should be prioritising and ought to be prioritising, I think given the circumstances of austerity, I think its first port of call really has to be, you know, doing something visibly and obviously to reverse at least some of that as rapidly as you can. And that is a simple sort of spending decision at that point in time. In 2017, if we'd won in June, whatever date it was, June or something, we were going to have an emergency budget in sort of July time to clear the way for removing tuition fees in September that year, which is quite a quick, simple thing to do because you don't need primary legislation, you just increase the spending. And things like that are quite good as a priority because what you're doing at this point, and this leads into the kind of pre-election or pre-forming a government point about prioritisation, what you're doing at that point is making a very clear symbol about what kind of government you are, right? You are telling people that we're going to do things differently and we're going to do them fast and your life is going to be better as a result. And if you can find things that look like that, that to me looks like a priority. The particular case of tuition fees, which I thought became kind of emblematic of a lot of the campaign, because it was an ideal bit of political communication because it was a single policy that was big and dramatic and it told everybody what kind of government this was going to be. It was a kind of part that stood in for a whole. I think the literature word is synecdoche. I didn't do literature, but I believe that's what you might call it. So it's a small thing that tells you about what all the other things this government might do would be like. If you can get something like that, then that creates a narrative about what your whole government is, and this is, I think, is the issue of communication. I don't agree particularly with let's have a big long list and something that appeals to everyone. I think the key to this is what is the story about what the government's going to do. We had a good one in 2017. You can see one emerging now, and I think you can see one emerge around the manifesto on Thursday, around a theme of climate change, but also this kind of future-focused element that you saw with the broadband on that. Final little bit on, because you asked about to what extent is this viable, and is it a paradigm shift. There is a view I think it's dying off. There is a view of sort of Corbynism, the Corbyn moment, as a weird aberration, like this peculiar blip in history that you know, there's one version of the story. It was basically Jeremy Corbyn's only there because Eric Joyce got into a fight in the Strangers Bar, and this sort of resulted in some shenanigans allegedly around the Falkirk by-election. Then we had to rewrite the Labour leadership election rules, and that was how we got Jeremy Corbyn. You know, it's kind of butterfly flapping its wings version of the history. The truth here is that this is far more fundamental. The basic kind of planks of support for really neoliberal capitalism, perhaps capitalism in general in Britain, look increasingly threadbare. That if you're young in particular, most of the promises, if you arrived in the labour market after 2008, most of the promises, what you think about capitalism, society should or could be doing for you, a stable job, a career, a house that you can own, that sort of thing, has been taken away. And until that comes back in some form, the conditions for something like Corbynism will always be there, and the kind of radicalism that it contains will always be there. So that is really the fundamental reason why I think this isn't going away anytime soon. And I think the kind of extent to which, you know, institutions like the IPPR or the New Economics Foundation or some of the newer think tanks, the kind of intellectual ferment around that has also started to map out what a different kind of 21st century socialism looks like. So there's a material base for it, and I think there's also growing evidence for a kind of intellectual base for this as well.
Great, thanks, James. Florence, do you want to talk about this point about the 2019 election and beyond?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing that I think is that it is just really important that if Labour does not win the election, and then if Jeremy Corbyn does not remain as leader, that the Labour Party does not take that as a reason to abandon this agenda, because I think that would be a really dangerous and not very sensible route forward. So I think it really has to remain there within the Labour Party, because there's no other alternative for the Labour Party to be a kind of credible, radical alternative. I suppose on the kind of other possible angle to come at your question from, that is, could a Corbyn government enact a paradigm shift that convinces the right of the political spectrum to kind of get on board? I suppose that the word convince there is the right word to use. I think that bringing about a paradigm shift in political economy means changing the structures within which you work, the institutions, but also public opinion, what people, voters want and expect, and the kind of social basis of power. So movements like the trade union movement, changing all of those things so that the other side, it doesn't matter whether or not they particularly like it, over time they're just going to have to come to pretend that they do. Otherwise they will not be able to convince people that they are backing the thing that is dominant or hegemonic. So I think a Corbyn government that put this stuff into place would change the context and then would force the Tory party ultimately to change.
Great. Karis, to you, sort of again the point about priorities.
I think it's quite an important question, partly because there's just a huge amount of policy coming out of the Labour Party at the moment, and clearly they're not going to be able to do all of it straight away. I guess I'd reiterate James's point about needing to do something that makes a tangible impact to people's lives straight away. But then in addition to that, I think the other things that need to be thought about, one, and this is quite a techie point, but certain tax changes might cause behaviour to change, and if you pre-announce it and then take a while to actually implement it, then you can cause some quite big behaviour changes that I think would need thinking through. That depends what's in the manifesto, of course. But then also in terms of there's a huge investment programme planned, and the criticism always comes back is that there aren't investment-ready projects, there aren't shovel-ready projects. So I guess in a 5-year term, you would need to think very early on about how to get those things going and get them ready so that they can be invested in straight away.
Thanks. Simon, did you want to come back on something?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Okay, just a point about what's the first thing that the government should do. I actually think starting with tuition fees, if you had done that in 2017, would have been completely the wrong thing to do. And let me say why. Because you're essentially appealing to what Piketty says it calls the Brahmin left, which is the new base for Labour. And you've kind of got them on side anyway. What you really need to do is start appealing to the working class, which Labour have been gradually losing. And tuition fees doesn't really do that, I don't think. So something that does, I think, would be much more effective. I never buy this argument on lack of shovel-ready projects. We still see the flooding that we've had. I mean, you ask the people who manage flood defences, and they'll reel off a whole load of things they can do if they have the money and the manpower. So there's tons of shovel-ready stuff there. You just need to drive on roads to see there's a lot of hole filling you can do. So there's plenty of shovel-ready stuff. So I think that's really a non-argument. In terms of how much all this requires a Labour government, I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of in two minds. I mean, you could say that one of Corbyn's achievements already has been to get all the parties saying no more austerity. And it's an interesting question whether that would have happened anyway, or whether it has been a result of Labour's success in 2017. But I'm afraid that I kind of see this coming election as critical, because I don't think you'll gradually see the Conservative Party adopting some of these ideas if they get into power. They'll do Brexit. That's going to put huge financial pressure on them, and they're going to react in completely the wrong way to that. So I kind of see that this is going to be the parting of ways, really, depending on who wins, I'm afraid. Okay.
Great, okay. I'm going to open it up to questions. Having asked two slightly rambling questions, I'm now going to be really authoritarian. So if possible, one sentence. If it doesn't finish with a question mark, I'll probably just ignore you. Can I see some hands, please? I will take them in threes, but I'll try to direct them to people so they can't avoid them. Are there any women who want to ask questions? Yes, over here, and there's a roving mic coming towards you.
My question is for Simon. So you mentioned about moving away from a shareholder-based economy, which sounds great. I just wanted to know, in practicality, what does this actually mean? What does the Labour manifesto say about it? Thank you.
Great, thanks. If you want to say your name, and if you're from somewhere that you want to say you're from, feel free to say it. Okay, we've got someone towards the back, I think in a black jacket. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Al, and I'm a student here at Queen Mary. I just wanted to ask, so James, you mentioned briefly the Labour's plan to partly nationalise BT and provide internet for free. So do you think that this would actually help productivity, or it could stifle competition? So, and I'd be interested to hear your views as well, Simon.
Okay, great. And finally, we've got a man here in a white t-shirt who looks very eager to ask a question.
Okay, I apologise on behalf of my inability to focus on specific questions. I'm going to try and be specific. My name's Patrick, I work in the NHS. this is obiter. This is just not part of the question. The fact is the 22 billion that has been allocated in funding by both Labour and Conservatives just fills the gap in public-private partnerships. It is not actually new money for the NHS, it just balances the books. That's neither here nor there. I would like to just highlight, I believe, Florence's point with regard to structural inequality and the fact that when we talk of, like, there was only one mention of class and working class, and yet, you know, this abolition of public schools. Public schools are designed to teach students or become public office.
So
can
you get to the
so my
question?
point is this. If we have a class-based society, which we do, if we were to reject the Thatcherite Friedman notion that there is no such thing as society, just individuals and families, and how do we counterweigh the structural imbalances and the forces that have a vested interest and have had since the 80s with Thatcher and Reagan in keeping the power imbalances that Corbyn is utopian, utopia being ancient Greek for a dystopia that never actually occurs. It's great if Corbyn got, and the very scary thing is, I read on the Evening Standard, and then there's
so
Boris Johnson is saying exactly what
so
Corbyn is saying. It's nuts, and I'd love for it to happen, but I just think the powers that be.
Okay, thanks. So I think it was sort of a question about power imbalances and the class system, how to address it. I'm going to interpret that as being about the sort of challenges for a Labour government of the sort of entrenched power imbalances that they're going to have to deal with in implementing a radical programme. Thank you. So Simon, first for you, there was a question about what you meant by a shareholder economy. I think.
No, what I meant about moving away from shareholder.
Oh, moving away. Sorry.
No,
sorry,
what I mean,
sorry,
no, I'm going to turn around to a question for James. I mean, I'm not quite sure what Labour's trying to move to, although I agree we need to move. So if I just make it concrete and say, let's think about Germany and how they, you know, have worker involvement with firms. Is that the kind of model you want to get to, or do you want to do something different?
Does anyone in particular want to respond to, there's a point about whether nationalisation is going to sort of harm competition, and then there's this other question about power imbalances.
I'll sort of take the class question.
Go on.
So I guess one thing that I think is important here is the trade union movement and other social movements that can provide a kind of counterweight to vested interests, to structural inequalities. And I guess the other thing that I think is really interesting that's going on more and more at the moment is deliberative democracy, which lots of councils are doing around the country. Camden Council has done lots of citizens' assemblies over the last couple of years. They've just done a big climate one. And you can use that model of deliberative democracy to think about the economy, not just to think about other kinds of issues like how you spend your money or what you're going to want to do about climate change. You can use deliberative democracy to think about how the economy should be structured in particular areas or in whole countries. And I think that kind of model might provide a democratic counterweight to some of those structures and vested interests.
Great, thank you. And either Karis or James, do you want to sort of respond to this point about nationalisation and whether nationalisation, I think, particularly of broadband infrastructure, is kind of.
And they'll come back in the other two. That
I think that's probably more in your
okay.
work, isn't it?
Thanks for that. All right. Okay, so I had about three things there on the nationalisation on the broadband. Look, The basic issue here is this, is that you have something that if you install an entire full fibre broadband network across the whole country, you only need to do that once, right? It's a sort of natural monopoly. There's no need to build another one and have some form of competition between the two. The challenge is getting to that thing that has been built, right? And that is where at the minute we have a sort of model in which there are a few potentially competing firms in a slightly managed competition way, with some inducements from government to try and get them to go and supply fibre optics to hard to reach places. This is the £5 billion that Boris Johnson claims he's put aside for it. It turns into about 1.7 billion, I think, is the total spend in trying to persuade companies to go off and do this. We have in this country about 7% of households and firms are connected to full fibre broadband. If you go to, if you go to Bulgaria, it's just over half, where they've had a real push from the government to do it. If you go to Spain, it's about 70%, Portugal 90%. By the time you get to South Korea and Japan, which have had very, very state-led versions of this, you're close to 100% coverage. The model of competition we have at the minute is not delivering this on the scale you want. So you have to use some other version of delivery. And that is the point about saying this has to be provided through the public and this has to be provided by a kind of nationalised delivery service. This does happen elsewhere. And it's because it's a natural monopoly that the case for saying let's have competition in these things I think is particularly weak. So I suppose that's the answer at that one. We want to get the thing built, and at the minute the competitive market version of doing this isn't working effectively. So you have to do something else. You have to get the government to do it. And then once it's built, there is a limited economic case for saying there should be competition. There won't be competition because it's a natural monopoly. On what do we want to get to? Around what is the end point? Do we want to get to Germany or do we want to get somewhere? To be honest with you, I'd settle for Germany. I'd settle for Denmark or something. I think that's like, if we go from where we are now, which is this sort of god-awful mess of like neoliberalism for a long period of time, combined with some institutions that are just very hard for governments to get rid of that aren't very neoliberal, like the NHS, then you end up with this, basically a car crash economy that doesn't really produce the goods for most people, and that's where we live. So if we can get something a bit better than that, I think that's actually not a bad place to get to. I'd be quite happy if we get to Denmark out of that. Right? And that, I think, is part of the issue of the Corbyn programme in general, that a lot of what it amounts to, if you say, Simon mentioned this, if you have a national investment bank, this is not unheard of in the rest of the developed world. This is not some big, crazy thing. If you say, let's have railways that are publicly owned, this is not some mad, radical thing that is utterly unheard of. Where on earth are we going? The same thing with broadband. These are not crazy things. Let's increase taxes a bit for people at the top of society. This does happen elsewhere. Let's not drive through spending cuts that hurt the poorest in society for 8-9 years. This is not wild radicalism. And if you start to do these things, that's the kind of version of Corbynism, which is, I'm not going to suggest it's an election slogan, but you're moving Britain from a place of being a real outlier in terms of investment, inequality, all of these things, in terms of economic governance, to somewhere that's much more like a kind of Northern European settlement. Make Britain normal again is kind of what we're getting to here, right? So that's part of it. And I'd be happy with that. I think, frankly, if you get 5 years and we look a bit more like Denmark and a bit less like Wild West or wherever the hell we're going to get to with Boris Johnson, that's not bad. But there is a point about looking beyond this point, and it's in two parts. One, what do you do about climate change? Like, the challenge of climate change is not one that's addressed just by saying, let's spend a bit more money. I think you also have to say we have to produce differently and work differently. Work has to happen in different places, people doing different things. Part of the programme already looks like that. When you say you're going to employ a large number of people installing loft insulation, which has a huge impact on people's heating bills, but perhaps more generally for society has a big impact on carbon dioxide emissions, on greenhouse gas emissions, because you have a more efficient, energy-efficient home. This is a shift in how people are employed. This is quite a big change in how people are going to live their lives. You can extend that when you start rolling out smart grids, which, by the way, have huge challenges about the use and ownership of data from those smart grids. You do not necessarily want Google and Amazon and whoever else it might be turning up and also gobbling all that data up. There are challenges here in how we live and how we work and all the rest of it that if you want to address climate change, you start to get into. Raising the idea of a 4-day week. The climate change impact of this is huge because you reduce commuting times is the most obvious part of that. This is a change in how we work. So it's bigger than just spend some money. If you want to tackle climate change seriously, you have to think beyond just going, we're going to do a kind of spend some more money, build a few institutions, it will look a bit better. You have to go bigger than this. That's one part of it. The other part, I think, is the more fundamental one around ownership, which is, actually, I would like to, and I think John and Jeremy come from this tradition that's been somewhat buried in Britain for a long period of time, that The tradition is of socialism from below, of decentralisation, of radical initiatives being taken outside of government, but done in a collective way, done in a recognisably socialist fashion. The tradition of the Institute of Workers' Control, of G.D.H. Cole, of R.H. Tawney, of, you can go all the way back to the Chartists actually, and further beyond. You can see that there. And it's been somewhat buried on the left in Britain. And part of what Corbynism has done is drag that tradition out and say that this could be an attractive model for what a future society looks like, that it's not one where government is just there to solve every problem. Of course, it solves a lot, but it's not one where the state is automatically the object of what a socialist society looks like. In fact, it's one where you have decentralised collective forms of ownership spread throughout society, and this is the kind of economy we want to build.
No, I can't remember if there was something else that you need to answer.
Almost certainly, but I feel like I've gone on
don't
here.
worry about it. I'm looking at Tim to make sure I'm allowed to take one very quick round of questions. Okay, I'm going to take 3 questions, and I'm afraid that's going to be it. Megan, man in the front row in a grey jacket, and man here in a blue shirt.
Thank you. So it's been very interesting learning about what is Corbynomics, and I just wanted to talk about essentially, and Nick can correct me on this, but there was something about Thatcherism in terms of, I can't remember if it was Tony Burton or Ken Livingstone who said that there was a narrative told, and that narrative had become prevalent, which I think has been mentioned by the panel, that it's the story that the general electorate comes to believe. So very
Megan,
quickly, and
I'm going to
not
have to
very,
ask you to get to the question, I'm sorry.
Yes, thanks. Is that essentially how does Corbynomics, how does that become the prevalent narrative? How is that built in the general electorate? And more importantly, how is that done over the next 24 days?
Great.
Question for James, Karis and Simon. You all signed a letter in the FT recently which said stock-based compensation is not a real expense for a company. How can you justify that?
Great, and yeah.
I just wanted to ask a bit further on the climate change idea. What does Corbynomics have to say about a more sustainable economic model, a non-extractive model, and is anybody in the left brave enough to talk about moving to a model without growth?
Great. Okay, so in that case, I think I'm going to ask James and Florence to talk about building a narrative. Therefore, if Karis and or Simon can talk about stock-based compensation, and I feel like James has talked quite a lot about climate change, so does anyone else want to say something about sort of transition in that sense, Karis?
Yeah,
and Simon? Yeah, okay, great. So in that case, Florence, do you want to start on narrative? James then come in on narrative and then... Okay.
Yeah, I feel like what James was saying at the start went quite a long way towards setting out what the alternative narrative is. And I think it is quite simply around pointing out that it was not public spending that broke the economy. It was a financial crisis generated by the financial sector, by banks doing risky and unwise things. And the mess then had to be cleaned up by the government. And I think that reconfiguring how that critical moment in our recent history is seen, I don't think it actually should be that difficult, because most people, I think, understand on quite a basic level that nurses didn't cause the financial crisis. So that would be my kind of quite simple start to answering that question.
And James, do you have anything to say about
all right.
narrative?
On narrative, I mean, the first one is that, look, the way in which this has shifted on austerity in particular is quite striking to see that the Conservatives have flipped on their head their claim the last sort of 8-9 years that that spending cuts are utterly necessary, and now it's like austerity is over, here's some more cash, this is the frame that we're now operating in. So I feel like the argument that we had to have in 2017, that basically austerity is bad, let's do something about it, has shifted into an argument about what is the future going to look like. And there is a reasonable case here for saying that unless the left can define what the future looks like, unless it owns the future in some sense, it's not going to own a narrative that people want to be a part of more generally. You can see it in 45, you can see it to some extent with Blair in 1997. There was quite a striking bit of work by Nesta on the 2015 election, doing a sort of content analysis of party manifestos. And their content analysis, where you kind of get a computer to read through and pick out words, whether it's, in this case, future focus, talking about the future, talking about what's going to happen, or more talking about the past. And they said, looking at their manifestos, the Conservative Party manifesto in 2015 was wildly focused on the future. It was overwhelmingly talking about what is going to happen in the future. And the Labour manifesto was really talking about the past. Now, that is not a place you want to get to if you're on the left. Right? That's what happened in 2015. I think in 2017 we started to shift that. I think this time round we have to look like we have the future, and it has to look like a future people want to be part of. That, I think, is when you get the narrative and you get in people's heads that this is the world we want to build and this is why you should vote for it.
Great. And so on the question about stocks, did both James and Simon sign the letter in question? Simon, do you want to?
I don't want to answer the question, though.
Do you want to answer the question?
No.
You don't want to answer the question? No one wants to answer the question.
So, do you regret signing the letter? No, of course not. I just reject the premises of your question. It wasn't about stock-based compensation, it was about inclusive ownership funds, but there we go, which is not stock-based compensation. Also, you've had people point this out to you that you're taking the accountancy here is a little odd, but there we go.
Okay, and finally, on climate change, Caris, then Simon.
Yeah, so I think it's a really important question. I think it's really fantastic, first of all, that this has really risen up the agenda over the past year. I think the politics of climate change is extremely different now to what it was a year ago. I think the Green New Deal clearly has huge potential in terms of offering an option that could actually so the justice element of this isn't optional. If you want people to support a climate agenda, then you need to make sure that it works for them. So I think there are a whole load of benefits from the Green New Deal that you see kind of reflected in the Green Industrial Revolution, although I personally hate that phrase, so I don't know if it's the best one in terms of persuading people. But I do think there's kind of more that needs to be done, and in particular putting limits on what our economy can and can't do. So one thing that we recommended, for instance, is a Sustainable Economy Act that would put legal limits on the economy and boundaries around that, to make sure that we're not exceeding what the UK can actually do. I think the other part of it, I mean, obviously the growth question people talk about and go back and forth on round and round. Personally, I think a very good start would be to stop thinking of growth as the be-all and end-all, and instead use a wider set of measures that show what the economy is for, that better reflect the experience of people's lives. I think that's something that a lot of people can agree on. And then the separate question of, can you effectively decouple GDP growth from carbon emissions is a separate one that I think you tackle next, but certainly there's a lot we can do in terms of rethinking what it is we actually value in our economy and what we see as success.
Great, thanks. And Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an economist, so I'm not going to be very happy with someone who tells me, well, because of climate change, we've got to stop wanting to consume more things. Not only am I not going to be happy, but everyone else isn't going to be happy. So in terms of an idea to get people on board with climate change, it is the worst possible idea you could have. But more importantly, it's the wrong idea, because what you really want to be talking about is what the growth involves. You know, growth per se is not a problem. It's growth that consumes carbon, it emits carbon that's the problem. Or growth that utilises resources at an unsustainable rate is the problem. It's not growth per se. And, having a Green New Deal will increase growth. No, it's just talking about growth as if it's a problem is trying to tell people that they shouldn't have the aspirations they do. And it's just a non-starter in my view.
Great. Okay. Thank you. And that is going to bring us to a close. Just a reminder to anyone who's unaware, there's going to be drinks just outside in the foyer, so there's a chance to discuss the event and catch the speakers there if you want to. And just to let you know that the next events at the Mile End Institute will be Adrift, Britain's Global Role After Brexit, on the 5th of December at 6:30. Thanks to the panel.